The town of Los Angeles was forever altered by a day that began with routine and ended in chaos, loss, and heartbreak. What began as a desperate flight from danger turned into one of the most tragic and devastating events in the history of the Spencer family. It all started with Luna, a woman tangled in a complex web of deceit, fear, and responsibility. She was on the run, her life at risk from enemies who had been pursuing her for weeks. In her panic, Luna could not see the road ahead clearly, and her desperate attempt to escape the danger led her to lose control of her car. Her vehicle swerved violently, heading straight into oncoming traffic, and before she could correct her path, the crash was inevitable. The impact of the collision was catastrophic, throwing Luna's car off the road, spinning wildly in the air. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, a deafening scream that seemed to last forever. But the chaos was not over. Bill Spencer, who had been driving behind Luna, was too close to react in time. The sight of Luna's car careening off the road was shocking, but in those split seconds, it was too late. Bill's car smashed into the wreckage of Luna's vehicle with terrifying force. The crash sent Bill's car hurtling out of control, flipping and crumpling under the sheer force of the impact. The violent collision left Bill severely injured, his body pinned beneath the wreckage, barely alive. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but despite their best efforts, Bill's injuries were far too severe. On his way to the hospital, Bill Spencer, the powerful and commanding patriarch of the Spencer family, succumbed to his wounds. His death was swift, but the devastation left behind was insurmountable. The Spencer family had lost its leader, and a chapter of the family's legacy came to a heartbreaking end. However, the tragedy did not end with Bill's death. Luna, who had been in the car with him, was also severely injured. The injuries she sustained in the crash were too much for her body to bear, and she, too, succumbed to her wounds. Luna, who had been carrying Will's child, was gone. The child she carried, the child who represented hope for the Spencer family's future, was also lost in an instant. The pain of Luna's death was compounded by the devastating loss of the child she had been carrying. In one catastrophic moment, Will had lost both his father and his unborn child. The two deaths, occurring so close together, shook the very foundation of his world. Will had already been dealing with a whirlwind of emotions, navigating the complexities of his relationship with Luna and the upcoming birth of his child. Now, the sudden and violent deaths of both Bill and Luna left him in a state of profound shock and confusion. He was caught in a maelstrom of grief, loss, and anger, unable to process the full extent of the tragedy that had unfolded before him. Will found himself spiraling. The grief of losing his father was unbearable, but the loss of his child, the child that was supposed to be the future of the Spencer family, seemed even more unimaginable. The combination of losing both his father and his son within a single day left Will emotionally crippled. He was lost in his pain, struggling to understand how something so devastating could happen to him, to his family. But beyond the overwhelming sadness, Will couldn't shake the creeping feeling that something more was at play. The circumstances surrounding the crash, the fact that Luna had been running from something, the suddenness of the accident began to raise more questions than answers. Was it really just a tragic, random incident, or was there something more to it? Was Luna's death and Bill's untimely demise just an accident, or were they part of a larger, more sinister plot? Will's mind raced as he began to search for answers. The more he thought about it, the more he began to believe that the crash hadn't been a mere accident. Luna's frantic behavior before the crash, her desperate flight from an unseen enemy, made him suspect that there was more to the story. He couldn't shake the feeling that the accident was a result of a deliberate plan, one that was aimed at destroying his family. Could it be possible that Luna's death wasn't just a result of her fleeing danger but a calculated move to target the Spencer family? What if the crash had been orchestrated to wipe out Bill, and Luna's death had been an unintended consequence? Will's mind began to form a theory, one that was as chilling as it was plausible. Could someone have been after Bill, using Luna as a pawn in a much larger scheme? Could there be enemies lurking in the shadows, pulling the strings to bring down the Spencer family once and for all? The more Will tried to make sense of the events that had unfolded, the more uncertain he became. The grief was overwhelming, but the sense of injustice, of something dark and hidden behind the crash, gnawed at him. He knew that he couldn't just accept the events as they had happened. He had to find the truth, no matter where it led. The investigation into the crash began, and Will threw himself into it, determined to uncover every detail, every piece of information that could lead him to the truth. He spoke to witnesses, retraced Luna's steps, and even questioned those closest to him. But the more he uncovered, the more he began to realize just how dangerous the situation had become. The more Will dug into Luna's past, the more he uncovered secrets and lies. He learned that Luna had been involved in something far larger than he had realized, had been running from powerful people who had been using her for their own purposes. The pieces began to fall into place. Bill's death, Luna's frantic behavior, and the subsequent crash were not just random occurrences, they were part of a much larger conspiracy aimed at destroying the Spencer family. Someone had wanted Bill dead, and Luna's death was collateral damage in a plot that had been years in the making. Will was left reeling, his world turned upside down by the revelation. His father's death had not been a random act of fate, it had been a targeted attack. And Luna's role in all of this only deepened the mystery. Who could be behind this attack? Why had they chosen to target Bill? And what did they want from the Spencer family? As Will confronted these questions, his emotional state began to unravel further. He had lost so much already, and now the weight of knowing that his father's death was part of a larger scheme made him feel even more helpless. The sense of betrayal, anger, and grief consumed him. But Will couldn't stop now. He couldn't let his father's death go unanswered. He knew that to uncover the truth, he would have to confront the people who were responsible for the tragedy, no matter the cost. As Will's investigation deepened, he found himself entangled in a dangerous game. The people who had orchestrated the crash were not going to let him uncover the truth without a fight. Will soon found himself up against forces much stronger and more powerful than he had ever anticipated. The battle for justice had only just begun, and as Will dug deeper into the dark web of deception surrounding his family's tragedy, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with danger and unimaginable consequences. The deaths of Bill and Luna were just the beginning. What came next would test Will's resolve, his strength, and his ability to survive in a world where betrayal, conspiracy, and loss threatened everything he had left. The storm had only just begun, and Will Spencer was caught in the eye of it. Will Spencer's journey into the darkness surrounding the deaths of both his father, Bill, and his unborn child was just beginning. But already the weight of his grief and the revelation of betrayal were driving him to the edge. Every step closer to uncovering the truth about the crash seemed to drag him deeper into a pit of uncertainty and danger. The more he investigated, the clearer it became that the tragic accident, which had robbed him of everything he held dear, was no mere coincidence. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to destroy the Spencer family once and for all. His suspicions were growing, and as the days passed, Will became more and more obsessed with finding answers. He started piecing together the fragments of Luna's life and the mysterious forces she had been running from before the crash. With each new lead, his anxiety and determination increased. It was clear that Luna, who had once been the woman he loved, had been drawn into a web of deceit and manipulation far beyond her control. But who was pulling the strings? Who had orchestrated this horrific chain of events? Will's mind raced as he revisited every encounter, every conversation he'd had with Luna before the crash. The connection between her and the Forrester family had always seemed ambiguous, but now it seemed like a much darker thread tying Luna's fate to the larger picture. Luna had been more involved with the Forresters than anyone had realized, and her desperate flight from danger now made sense. She had been trying to escape something Zaminhow had put her life in jeopardy, and in turn, had brought about Bill's untimely death. But the deeper Will dug, the more complex the puzzle became. There were people within the Forrester family who had much to gain from Bill's death, and Luna's own history with them pointed toward a hidden conspiracy that stretched much further than he had initially thought. The Forresters, who had always been rivals to the Spencer family, had long carried their own grudges and dark secrets. Will began to suspect that Bill's death was part of a much larger scheme, one that involved some of the most powerful figures in the fashion world. But what could they want from Bill? What had been their true motive for eliminating him and his legacy? Will's investigation led him to a startling conclusion. Bill had been targeted because he knew too much. He had gotten too close to a series of business deals that, if revealed, could have destroyed not only the Forresters, but many others within their circle. Bill had built an empire, but that empire had enemies, and those enemies would do anything to see it fall. Luna had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept into a storm of corporate espionage, family betrayal, and revenge. And now she was going along with the child she carried. The loss of Bill had already devastated Will, but the realization that the Spencer family had been intentionally torn apart by those they once considered enemies was a bitter pill to swallow. Will's grief, compounded by the sense of betrayal, turned into something darker. The question of justice consumed him. He was no longer simply mourning the loss of his father and child. He was now driven by an insatiable need for revenge. The family that had orchestrated his heartbreak, the ones responsible for the deaths of Bill and Luna, would pay. Will could feel the fire of his rage building, propelling him to confront those who had wronged him. The Forresters would not get away with this. But there were those who stood in his way, people who wanted to protect their own secrets and shield themselves from the consequences of their actions. The first person Will turned to for help was his mother, Katie. She had lost so much already, and her heartache over Bill's death was almost unbearable. But she too was left reeling by the news of the conspiracy and the idea that their family had been purposefully destroyed. Katie, though heartbroken, understood the urgency of their situation. She knew that they needed to act fast, but she was terrified by the direction Will's obsession was heading. She feared that his drive for revenge would lead him down a path of destruction that he might not be able to return from. As Katie and Will began to piece together what had truly happened, their suspicions fell on the Forrester family matriarch, Stephanie Forrester. A formidable woman with a reputation for controlling everything around her, Stephanie had long been a powerful force in the fashion world. The more Will and Katie uncovered about the events leading up to Bill's death, the clearer it became that Stephanie had played a pivotal role. She had been working behind the scenes, manipulating people, making deals, and ensuring that Bill's downfall would be inevitable. The Forresters had orchestrated a plan to destroy Bill, and Stephanie had been at the center of it all. But why? What had driven her to such extremes? Will found himself face to face with Stephanie, confronting her about her role in the conspiracy. But the conversation was not what he expected. Stephanie remained calm, almost detached, as she listened to Will's accusations. She didn't deny her involvement in the scheme. In fact, she admitted to using whatever means necessary to ensure Bill's fall. The reasons behind her actions were more complicated than Will had realized, but they were rooted in deep-seated resentment. The Forrester family had always seen Bill as a rival, someone who threatened their empire. But for Stephanie, it went deeper. Bill had been a reminder of all her failures, a symbol of the power and control she had lost over the years. Killing Bill, she believed, would restore balance, bring the Forrester name back to its rightful place. And Luna. She had been a casualty, an unintended victim caught in the crossfire. Will's blood boiled as he heard Stephanie's cold words. The truth was even more horrifying than he could have imagined. But the revelations didn't stop there. As Will pushed deeper, he uncovered a trail of betrayals that stretched back years. It wasn't just Stephanie. Other members of the Forrester family had played roles in the plot, and many had hidden agendas of their own. The conspiracy was much larger than just Bill's death. It had been about destroying everything Spencer had built, leaving nothing behind. The more Will discovered, the more determined he became to make the Forresters pay for their actions. The cost of justice was steep, but Will wasn't willing to let go. He couldn't forgive them. The pain, the betrayal, and the loss of his father and child demanded retribution. Will's thirst for vengeance became all-consuming. His rage began to cloud his judgment, driving him to take dangerous risks. The confrontation with Stephanie had only ignited his anger further, but it had also revealed just how deeply the Spencer family's enemies were embedded within the Forrester clan. But Will wasn't alone in his pursuit of the truth. Katie remained by his side, urging him to stay focused, but also to be cautious. She feared for his safety, and she feared what the pursuit of vengeance might do to his soul. Still, she couldn't deny the call for justice that burned within both of them. They had lost too much already, and they were willing to fight with everything they had left. As the tension between the Spencers and the Forresters grew to a boiling point, Will knew that there was no turning back. He had lost so much, but now the fight was not just about grief. It was about survival. The future of the Spencer family and their legacy was on the line. Will Spencer was determined to bring justice to those responsible for his father's death. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the cost of that justice would be far greater than Will had ever imagined. The battle for the Spencer name had only just begun, and the price of vengeance would come at a steep cost.